There's a handful of acousticians who have started to look at that record and understand how whale song is transmitted. And one of the big findings there is that whale song is culturally transmitted, so it's learned.
Hi, everybody. My name is Doug Barr, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the St. Helena Forum for Innovation and Creativity. The Forum, as most of you know, is an educational nonprofit with a mission to entertain, inform, and inspire by presenting a broad mix of humanities-based programming. Today, we'll be discussing two very interesting questions. Why do whales sing, and what do they sing about? To help us find answers, we have invited Dr. Michelle Fournet, an acoustic ecologist specializing in marine animal communications and the impacts of human activity on marine ecosystems. She's an assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire, where she leads the Marine Bioacoustics and Behavior Lab. She also directs the Sound Science Research Collective, which is a nonprofit she co-founded in 2018 to advance bioacoustics research for marine conservation and equity in science. Originally, she trained in theater and she earned her BFA from Boston University before transitioning to marine science. And then she completed a master's degree in marine resource management and a PhD in wildlife science at Oregon State University, where she studied humpback whale communication in Alaska. She later expanded her research during a postdoctoral fellowship at the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at Cornell University. In addition to cetaceans and fishes, Dr. Fournet's current research includes Arctic studies on bearded seals and investigations of gray and harbor seals in the Western Atlantic. Dr. Fournet is also a dedicated science communicator, featured in the 2021 Apple TV documentary called Fathom. And now, please welcome Dr. Michelle Fournet. Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Forum.
Oh, hello. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh, glad to have you. Thank you. Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, I see that you earned a BFA in theater arts from Boston University, but then you didn't become an actor and you didn't become a screenwriter or a director. You became an acoustic ecologist. So can you describe your work? What is an acoustic ecologist? What you do? And what about that work in acoustic ecology inspired you to take a relatively dramatic course correction from a life in the arts to a life in the sciences?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, being a creative person has helped me very much as a scientist. And I tell people that as an acoustic ecologist, my job is to be a professional listener. I listen to sounds of the natural world. So technically what that means is my job is to use the voices of animals to understand animal behavior and changes in ecological processes and how sound moves around the ocean. But from sort of a bigger picture perspective, what I'm doing is eavesdropping on the ocean. And as a professional eavesdropper, my goal is to tell these big scientific stories. So why does an animal make a sound that it does? What does that tell us about the changing world? And to be a good listener definitely requires skills in science, but it also requires a certain amount of intuition. So I'd say that part I got from being an artist first, and then the skills to do the work I got from being a scientist.
Excellent. That's excellent. You know, the idea of being a scientist is not so far from the arts anyway, because if you wake up every morning and say, what if? And then you go out and find out what if, and that is science ultimately as well. So that it's all very, very creative and very connected. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so when you made that transition, was that about what, 2006 or seven?
Yeah, I graduated from college in 2006 and I bought a one-way ticket to Mexico and decided I was going to backpack around Central America and learn to scuba dive. And that really sort of codified in my mind that being in and around the ocean needed to be a bigger part of my life story. And so I came back to the States sort of ready and with a wide open perspective on what I might do with my life. And there was this opportunity to go to Alaska to work on boats, and I jumped on it. And that particular choice changed the course of my life dramatically. So,
Interesting.
Mhm.
serendipity, something happened, you ran into somebody and it changed your life. Same with me in my life, which is makes for a very interesting life. So that's great.
Yeah.
Uh, so was there a lot of research being done around 2006 and 7 on whale song and whale calls and recording of all this stuff? Or at that point, it was still relatively new material?
So whale song was pretty well studied by 2006, 2007 when I started this work. But whale calls, which is every sound that a whale makes that isn't a song, was not completely undescribed, but very poorly described. So in Alaska, when I started recording whales, and I think we dropped our first hydrophone, or I dropped my first hydrophone in 2009, 2010. We didn't even have the basic vocabulary. We didn't even have a good description as to what Alaskan whales were saying, let alone what the structure was and what the social context was. So all of this effort had been put into understanding whales that sing, which are males that sing on breeding grounds, but almost no effort had been put into understanding what whales were talking about outside of reproduction. So, brand new field.
Interesting, interesting, and you've been doing that ever since. Continued on as your primary focus, humpback whales, correct?
Yes, yes, something that I thought was going to be sort of a small question. I wanted to understand how anthropogenic noise, how vessel noise changed humpback whale communication. I thought that was one question. That was 15, 16 years ago now, and I'm still trying to answer that question. So yeah, it turned into a life's work instead of just something that I just a curiosity.
Got it. Well, let's talk about humpback whales a little bit. Our viewers are a very mixed audience of people who are totally amateur on all of this, and there will be some academics as well. So let's just go through the basics of how big is a humpback whale and
Mm.
how how long is. I know the females are a little bit longer, but realistically, how long are they? How much do they weigh?
Sure. Yeah. So humpback whales are considered a medium sized baleen whale, which means they're about 35 to 45 feet long and they weigh about 35 or 40 tons. And yes, the females are a little bit bigger, the males are a little bit smaller, but they're huge from the moment they're born. When they're first born, they're 15 feet long and weigh 4,000 pounds.
Uh-huh.
And the babies are about a third the size of their mothers when they're born.
Wow.
So really, really enormous animals. If you want to think about it in context, they're roughly the size of a school bus. So, when you see kids getting on and off the bus, you can imagine them loading up onto the back of a humpback whale and then departing the back of a humpback
It's,
whale.
the idea of an aquatic school bus is an pretty interesting visual. Um, And yet, these gigantic, amazing animals, the more I read about them, the more amazed I am by them. But they manage to flip almost their entire bodies out of the water. And then they also flap these 16-foot long pectoral flippers on top of the water, which looks like they're having a grand time doing that. And I'm sure it's great for the whale boat people who have they're watching it.
Yeah.
But it struck me as being akin to something we talked about in a different episode, which was uh, do animals laugh? And in fact, what
Mm.
we've discovered was that there are play behaviors in many different kinds of animals, from bonobos to puppies to dogs, that do their own behaviors. And they also have vocalizations for play. Is there any chance, or maybe I'm completely off base, but is there any chance this could be a play behavior for whales when they do this?
The answer to that is sometimes. So, similar to humans and dogs and things like that, play behavior is a way of practicing behavior that you might need later in your adult life. So, I have a 2 year old daughter, and she spent an hour this morning putting her baby doll to sleep. She pats it on the back, she sings it a lullaby, and she's playing and she has a great time and she's laughing while she does it. Well, I also spent an hour putting a baby to bed, patting her on the back. I was not playing, I was trying to get my daughter to sleep.
Got it.
So, when we think about this in the context of animals, when we see younger whales or juvenile whales jumping out of the water and slapping their pectoral fins, yes, there's a strong link between that and play. And when we think about play, play is often joyful practice, practice that brings joy to an animal to codify that behavior so that later in life it can jump out of the water, and that might not be play behavior. That might be an aggressive behavior. That
Mhm.
might be a communication behavior. That might be a defensive behavior, but it was a behavior that was practiced over and over again over the course of the individual's life.
Fascinating. It's really interesting. Well, can you tell us how? Let's get into specific questions. A couple of them. How do they make the sounds? Is there a larynx? Is there an air pocket?
Ooh.
How do the sounds come out of whales for
That
both
is
and calls?
Yeah, that's a hard question. That's harder than you might think because we don't, we, you can't stick them under, an MRI very easily. Inside the sort of vocal structure of a whale is something called a vocal fold, which is very similar to a mammalian vocal cord. The difference is when we vocalize or when terrestrial mammals vocalize, we expire. So air goes out and across the vocal folds and then out into the world. This doesn't happen for baleen whales or humpback whales. The air stays internal, so they're not blowing bubbles when they vocalize. So this air is going to cross those vocal folds and go through a series of sinuses, and we think that that's how they form these really, really, really complex sounds. So it's not a larynx like you might find or a syrinx like you see in birds.
Right.
But yeah, think of it as being similar to how terrestrial animals might vocalize, except the air stays in and therefore it can be reused.
Got it. Got it. And let me jump to another question, a practical question. If whales dive between 260 feet all the way down to 2,000 feet, so they're underwater a lot, and they also migrate 9 to 10,000 miles a year occasionally that far. How do researchers like you track an individual whale or an individual pod? And how do you keep up with them? How do you see them? How do you record them? How is this? What's the mechanics
Oh,
of
that's a good question and it's tricky. So the way that I do it is instead of following the whale, I go to a spot where I know the whale will come to me. So I do almost all of my work in Southeast Alaska, and
Mhm.
humpback whales in Southeast Alaska have really, really high site fidelity, which means that they go back to the same place year after year after year. So if I go to Juneau, Alaska, and I drop a hydrophone, I know not only that whales are coming, but I also know which whales are going to be there. Every whale has a unique tail. So the underside of the whale's fluke, the tail, is like
Mhm.
a fingerprint. And you can photograph that fluke and put it into this really, really great app called Happy Whale, which is a citizen science app that scientists also use. And it's tracked the sighting history of that individual. So now I know who I'm looking at and I know where I'm watching them. And if I put a hydrophone in the water, I can begin to say, okay, this is the composition of the community that I'm listening to. Here are some of the players in that community. And then these are the sounds that they make.
Cool.
So, yeah, so I don't necessarily migrate back and forth with the whales, although I do some work down in Hawaii as well, which is where North Pacific humpback whales go to breed. But for me, most of my work is saying, okay, I'm going to go to your home and wait for you to show up.
So you're going back to see old friends every year or two, it sounds.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Whales that I've been watching for a very long time that I feel extremely fond of.
It's very cool, very cool. Well, hydrophones were made, I think, around the beginning of World War One, so that
Mhm.
the primitive submarines of the day wouldn't slam into icebergs. So they've been around a long time, the hydrophones and I assume the recording equipment, all of that. So is there a long record of songs that have been sung as if they were recording them that far back or how far back, however far back it was? And has anybody done a study of what did they sound like then and what 50 years or 30 years or 20 years later do they sound like now? And is there a change that if you studied them in great detail, you could see climate changes. You could see other things that might have changed their
So
song.
the answer to that is yes, yes, and no. So again, I'll give you a quick primer on how humpback whales communicate. Humpback whales produce songs, which is sung only by male whales and predominantly in a breeding context. So if you listened to the Song of the Humpback Whale, the album that made it out to the world, you were listening to male whales singing. But then there's also calls, which are more analogous to human words, which are shorter and they sort of use them as one offs produced by males, females, baby whales, old whales. And for song, we started recording it in the 1960s in Bermuda. Those are some of the earliest recordings that have ever been made. And that was the work of Roger and Katie Payne. And so there's this long record of whale song. And there's a handful of acousticians who have started to look at that record. And understand how whale song is transmitted. And one of the big findings there is that whale song is culturally transmitted, so it's learned.
Mhm.
The flip side of that is that we have a data set going back to 1984 in Alaska for humpback whale calls.
Mhm.
Now, song changes every year, but what we found in our work looking at calls, looking at, again, think of it as words, is
Right.
that songs change, but calls are used over and over and over and over again. So we've demonstrated a remarkable stability in the calls that whales are using on their foraging grounds. So as many as 3 generations of whales has passed, but they're still using the same calls. But even more so, we looked at whales that have been biologically separated by about 2 to 3 million years, and they have the same call types.
Huh.
So whales that haven't been in communication with one another, if they happen to be in the same place in the same time, would have a shared set of sounds that they both produce. So remarkable stability. Um, um, Again, longer than humans have existed on this planet, whales have been producing the same set of calls.
It's fascinating. It's really interesting. Did you bring some by any chance? Did you bring along some calls with you?
I did. So, there's a couple calls that I want to play for you today. The first is just going to be it's a large group of whales. There was about 35 whales present when we made this recording. And I like this one because it has a lot of different call types in it. So you're going to hear something that sounds like "Ooh," and that's a feeding call. And then you'll probably hear some like whoop, 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 whoop. Those are swaps and thwops. And then just a whole wide variety of calls. So take a listen to this and imagine that you're sitting in a small boat surrounded by 30 whales. I really love this recording.
Very cool. Very cool.
Mhm. Okay, so again, what you heard there was this really complicated acoustic exchange of a whole bunch of animals vocalizing.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
Now, the flip side of that is that even when whales are in really small groups or even when they're by themselves, they'll still vocalize. So there's one call type in particular, it's called the whoop call, that's been really ecologically important in the context of humpback whales, so much so that it's become a little bit the center of not only my research program, but several research programs. And this call we think is used as a contact call, so counter calling. And I'm going to play this one for you now, but I want you to note that this is just one whale that's coming into sort of an empty acoustic arena producing a sound. And the sound is going to sound a little bit like. So I'm going to play that now. I, so notice that that one's also much shorter. And I think now I'm completely biased here, but I think that this is one of the most delightful sounds in the entire animal kingdom. um, in part because it's just a lovely little thing to hear, but also it contains so much information. And this particular sound, that whoop call, is produced by adult whales, young whales, old whales, female whales, male whales, and it is produced all over the world. Every population of humpback whales that we have listened to, that we have looked for it, we have found that call type.
Amazing. Interesting. Wow. Wow. Hmm. Um, are, are, just so I'm clear, are calls and songs unique to each pod, or can they be unique to one pod? And is the information that they're giving maybe more pertinent to that pod than another pod?
Kind of. So humpbacks don't necessarily form pods. So
Mm.
when you think of pods, you're generally thinking of family groups, right? So like killer whales, for example, form pods. They stay with their mothers for life. And they stay in these really tight-knit groups and they stay with them forever. Humpback whales are a little more come and go, come into an arena, spend some time together, and then split off again. And they don't stay with the same individuals for long periods of time. But what we're starting to recognize now that we've sort of adjusted our sense of scale is that humpback whales are forming long term relationships. And in order to maintain those relationships, they have to find each other. So we think that instead of having a pod specific vocalization that you might see again with a dolphin or a killer whale, that humpback whales might be using these whoop calls to identify one another. And so that sound that you hear is unique to the individual.
Uh-huh.
And if they go and broadcast that into an acoustic arena, so if they to the open ocean and another whale hears it, if that whale recognizes that call, it might come and join up with them. So it isn't that pods of whales have specific vocalizations, at least not in terms of calls, but more that you could identify an individual whale by the sound of its voice.
So the voices then to the mother, to the child of these whales, the voice they would be using for that would be unique to that to them, obviously, uh,
Mhm.
and yet they still pass on the songs to next generations and to other gods
Yeah,
and songs as well.
yeah.
I guess, right?
Yeah, so song is culturally transmitted within a generation. So one male will sing, another male will sing the same song. So all of the whales in the same population will sing the same song. And every year that song will change. But the contrast to that is that the calls will stay the same over generational time. So on the one hand, we have song, which is culturally transmitted, it's complex and it's learned. And then we have calls, which seem to be at least partially innate. So, within any given year, if you go to a breeding ground and drop a hydrophone, you'll hear that all of the male whales are singing the same song.
It, it,
And
it's just so fascinating,
I know, and
isn't
it's
it?
really amazing. And then if you go to a different breeding ground, they'll be singing a different song. Um, But if you were to go to the foraging grounds and drop a hydrophone, you might find that even though they're from different populations, whales that don't know each other, they sing different songs. If you listen carefully, what you're going to hear is these little call and responses that pepper their communication strategy. So it what it means is that this is one of the most complex acoustic systems in the animal kingdom, one that involves a really high degree of learning, but also the ability to discriminate between who you're listening to and social context. So again, there's a lot of that is very similar to the human system, and a lot of it, of course, is very different. They live in a three-dimensional world, but this really really cool system of cultural complexity, and then these simple little calls that tell you who's who.
It is so unique. You know, it makes me think of another program we did, which was looking for signs of life in the universe outside of our own area here. And these animals seem like they could easily be found, not necessarily literally, but easily be found in one of the moons, frozen oceans of Saturn or Jupiter. And they're these ginormous animals. And if we had landed there and found them and saw this complexity and this astonishing culture that
Yeah.
these whales have, you would say, yeah, that makes some sense that they kind of maybe a little ahead of us. It's really it's so unique and romantic in the sense of it all.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And, and there have been some pretty strong parallels drawn between astrobiology and marine biology. So when you think about it, a lot of astrobiologists, or when you think about exoplanets and intelligence in space and things like that, like we are on the search for intelligent life, but we have intelligent life right here on this planet, and yet we cannot communicate with it. So, starting right here at home, trying to understand the voices of the natural world is a really, really great place to build the skills to understand the voices of what might occur beyond this world. So
Yeah.
it's a great practice ground when you start to think about really large scale communication.
See, so now I understand why you got out of the arts and went to the sciences. This is fascinating, fascinating stuff. It's really interesting. Um, so these songs, when you're recording the songs, then you eventually get them recorded, and then you break them down into units, subunits, subphrases, phrases, themes, and multiple themes, and figure out how the songs are all put together. How do you
Yeah.
use that information to better understand how the whales are communicating or what they're communicating about?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you about one project that I'm working on now with colleagues from Cornell University and the Hawaii Whale Research Consortium. So one of the things that we've been doing is collecting whale song in Hawaii, and there was a massive marine heat wave from 2015 to 2018, and 7,000 approximately, give or take 7,000 humpback whales died during that heat wave.
Mm.
And so a huge loss of life from the population. And one of the questions that we have is we're trying to understand whether or not that manifests in changes in cultural transmission. So has that affected the song? So we're looking at song that was recorded before the marine heat wave when the population was absolutely booming, lots and lots of whales, lots of baby whales, and trying to quantify the complexity. So how complex is this song? And then looking at recordings where we can find them from 2015 to 2018 to see, did the song get simpler? And then looking at again after the heat wave to see whether or not that level of complexity ramped back up again. And I can't tell you what the answer is because we're still in the middle of that analysis, but this is sort of one of our first attempts to understand um, how their system of communication responds to large scale ecological change, and
Yeah.
also how resilient humpback whales might be. We typically thought that this was the resilient whale, the whale that could survive almost anything because their populations have been going up, 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 up. But the sudden crash in the population has made us realize that it might be a little more precarious than we once thought. Right after humpback whales were delisted, we saw this massive, again, this population decline. So, listening to their songs and understanding the relationship between population level dynamics and individual behavior is going to help us understand the role that sound plays in their life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Obviously, a big amount of their life is spent with sound, and we do have oceans that become increasingly more dense with different kinds of sound, and it's going to be even more so as we start doing more underwater mining, which seems to be unfortunately back
Yeah.
on the table again. Um, I have a quote from you in which you said, "I have no desire to talk to whales. I leave them alone. The goal for me is to find out how they naturally interact and talk to each other." Uh, Can you expand on that? And it seemed to me that you were talking about, if you go if you're in the Amazon basin and you see a small handful of people that seem to be a little tribe that maybe never had seen other humans before, you would be destroying what they are now by simply meeting them. So you would want to avoid them. Is that how you think about it? The more input, so instead of talking to them and having conversations with them, uh, you're listening to them and watching them and listening to the behaviors and trying to correlate the two. Is that what
Yeah.
you mean in this?
Kind of. So, more or less, although everything's a little bit different when you start talking about people. But when we think about whales, my question with folks who say, like, I want to talk to a whale is why? Like,
Mhm.
who are you helping? And I think that all biologists should take their own version of an ecological Hippocratic oath that we should, and I certainly have committed to doing no harm. And so for me, understanding whales when they talk to each other gives me a great deal of resources. I get a lot of resources when I can understand what a whale is saying. I can make choices about how I manage my behavior, how humans manage our behavior in the ocean, if we understand what whales are saying and why it matters. But for me to go in the ocean and talk to a whale doesn't benefit the whale. It only benefits me. It sustains my personal curiosity, but we don't know enough about whales and how they communicate and why they communicate to do it in such a way that we can guarantee that we are not harming that animal. So I have heard people suggest that we should go to the ocean and see if we can change what whales sing about. And it might be possible, but we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't go into a system that has taken millions, 100 million years to perfect. And in our 150,000 years of species existence say that, you know what? I think I can improve this. So I think that there's a lot of humility that comes from being a biologist, and again, my goal My goal is to understand so that we can preserve, conserve, and then so that we can get that feeling of joy from knowing something exists. It's a big one, like the feeling of joy that we get. But that feeling of joy shouldn't, it certainly shouldn't damage the thing that we love.
Is there any evidence or any indication that you get when you are recording and when you have your boat and your equipment and it's all out there with the hydrophones that the animals that you're recording know you're there or have
Hmm.
noticed you? Do they pay any attention to you, or are they not even aware that you're there and you do your best to make that happen?
Yeah, if I do my job, they don't know I'm there.
Hmm.
So I often will do my work from shore. So I'll go put my hydrophones in the water and leave them there for a year, and then I'll camp on shore and watch the whales from there. So a lot of my research involves doing shore-based work, which for humpbacks is great. The closest that I've ever been to a humpback whale, I was standing in 12 inches of water and there was a whale just 9 feet away.
Wow, that must,
So
must
yeah,
have been cool.
it's so cool, really amazing experience. But there are times certainly when the whales know that I'm there. If I'm in a boat and I'm going through the water, they can hear me. And I often will turn my boat off just to be a good listener. And then I have to be quite cognizant because they might not know where I am, or they might not care where I am. But certainly for my part, the goal is always to do work that doesn't change the behavior of the animal, or certainly changes the behavior of the animal very, very little. So sometimes they have to, they adjust course to stay further away from my boat. And if my boat is in transit, they're going to vocalize louder so that they can hear each other when I'm there. But the goal is to be a passive observer whenever possible.
That was very clear in the documentary that you were in. That there two things were very clear that you're being careful of and not trying to involve yourself in what they were doing, but simply observe. And the other thing that was very clear was that the key thing that you have to be if you're an acoustic ecologist is patient. You have to be able to wait and wait and wait and wait, and then eventually, as it happened in that film, spoiler alert, if you're going to watch it and haven't it's on Apple, I think you can still find it,
Yeah.
is that it paid off. It pays off.
Yeah. Yes. Humpback whales can live to be over 100 years old. And the scale, I mean, they travel 5,000 miles every 6 months during their migration. The scale that whales live is much, much larger than our own. And what that means is I have to adjust my scale of observation accordingly. So I love what you said about patience. If
Hmm.
you don't, if you don't wait, if you're not patient, you're gonna miss it.
Yeah, interesting. It's
Mhm.
truth about life. If you don't, you're going to miss
Yes.
a lot. Um,
Mhm.
Language has long been considered uniquely human, as opposed to animals as well. And now we're learning all together, of course, what you've already learned a long time ago, which is that there are other real languages that are out there. Recently, though, I just read about, I think it was just in the last 2 months or so, and I'm sure you must have seen it probably. It's a breakthrough study by a team of international marine biologists, and like it was from a group from University of Auckland and another group from St. Andrews University, and they were talking about how methods. They were applying methods inspired by how human babies discover words and speech by applying those same methods to 8 years of humpback whale recordings. And they uncovered, and this is their claim anyway, and I'm sure it's true, I can assume it's true anyway, they discovered that the statistical structures found in all human languages are the same that we basically, our little ones learn by listening to the frequency of certain words out of the millions and millions of words that come their way daily.
Yeah.
Understand. I see this. I have a year-old granddaughter, and you have a 2-year-old. So you've just been through all of this. She listens, but the first words she's speaking are, of course, everybody has the mama papa wish, but in fact, in her case, her first words are no. She tries me to no, and it's apparently it's quite similar in the whale use of language as well. So I found
Yeah.
that fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're talking about the work by it's Ellen Garland and co-authors.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's
and
what it was.
she and I know each other. an extraordinary scientist. And the law that you're talking about is called Zipf's law. And and to very, very briefly explain Zipf's law, and I hope I get this right because it's not my area of expertise, but it's really cool. It's the idea that the most common word in a language is twice as common as the next common word, and so on and so forth. And so if you break down humpback whale song units, what they found is that it does follow Zipf's law.
Aha.
And so it does beg the question, are there universal efficiencies in acoustic communication?
Mm.
And if you are a social creature, will you follow them? And I really love this idea. And so I think that for creatures that have complex communication systems, we can start to look for this idea of Zipf's law. But I also really love the idea that it isn't a law of human linguistics. I mean, it is. Like Zipf's law is a law of human linguistics. But if it exists in humpback whales, isn't it actually a humpback law of linguistics and humans just do it too?
Yeah, that's what it would seem like, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
it?
So that in the same way that there are universal laws of physics and and the concept of evolution and that is a natural order to existence, it would then also make sense that some of that natural order in terms of efficiency and effectiveness would occur in how we communicate with one another.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is there evidence of within the relationships, and do you understand the relationships that are complex within families and within pod communities? Do you see?
Humpbacks don't have any kind of relationship that's familial. They don't stay in touch with their offspring. They don't have strong kinship bonds. There's some really scant evidence that humpback whales in the North Atlantic are more likely to interact occasionally with females that they might have a lineage with. But for the most part, the relationships that humpback whales form, they form voluntarily based on common interest. So in Southeast Alaska, for example, there are two discrete, we call them communities of humpback whales. The humpback whales that bubble net feed, so they engage in cooperative feeding, where they get together with large groups and they forage on fish and they work together to eat. And that's a discrete population. And then there are whales that don't cooperatively forage, that prefer to be by themselves, that they're solitary, or they might get together in small groups of one or two and feed on the same krill patch and then disaffiliate. And these two populations are socially discrete. But the interesting thing is the coordinated feeders, those that are cooperating, those relationships will last for decades, but
Hmm,
they are not related when
hmm.
they have done kinship studies on those individuals. So individuals that come back over and over and over, year after year after year, there is no familial relationship between those individuals. It is the action, the act of cooperatively foraging that draws them back together, not their genetic relatedness.
It's fascinating. Can you, since you brought it up, and I don't want to forget about it, I want to ask you if you could tell us how bubble net feeding works. And in
Yeah.
fact,
Yeah.
actually, the tool that they're using, because I've heard it referred to as they're using a tool.
Yes.
What is it, and how does
Yes.
that work? Because I'm sure that's not familiar with most people.
Oh, sure. And this is such an extraordinary thing. And if you've ever seen a humpback whale on television, this is probably what you saw. So, bubble net foraging is when anywhere, it can be done with just one whale, but we think of it as being done with large groups of whales. So, we'll say 5 or 6 whales all come together into a certain area. And in the North Atlantic, at least, there has to be herring present, Pacific herring, a specific type of fish. And the whales will begin to dive. And some of these whales will go underwater and begin to blow bubbles. Usually it's just one whale, but sometimes it's two. And it blows a ring of bubbles around the school of fish. Other whales will also dive and they lift up their bright white pectoral fins and they will use those fins to herd the fish into a smaller group. And then a different whale will begin to vocalize and it will produce a feeding call, that sound. And they will herd the fish up towards the surface of the water. So they're each playing discrete roles. You're the bubble blower, you're the vocalizer, you're the pectoral flasher. And they bring these fish up to the surface of the water. And then when the whale stops vocalizing, they will all open up their mouths and simultaneously devour as much of the school of fish as they possibly can. So it's this highly coordinated activity that increases the amount of prey that they get, and the bubbles are considered the tool.
Interesting.
So in some other populations, there's no vocalizer. They just use the bubbles. But all the different humpback whale populations around the world have some version of this. But in the North Pacific, those animals that do that highly choreographed dance maintain social bonds over very long time periods.
Very, very interesting. Well, if we define culture as a manifestation of intellectual or creative achievement that's regarded as that by a collective group, then would you say that whale songs can truly be called whale culture?
Yeah, yes, I do. I think that there is an assessment by females of male songs on are you how smart are you, how good is your memory, so it doesn't just say how long can you hold your breath but also how effectively can you recreate this cultural phenomena. Whales learning from one another in mass indicate that there's a value. So yeah, I would say by the standards that you just defined that this is absolutely culture.
It's really so interesting. All of these things are utterly fascinating. This is like we go on all day today. We're going to have to wrap it up relatively soon, but let me ask you just a couple more questions.
Sure.
How does information spread between the pods, assuming that it does spread between the pods? I know it's to some degree how it's passed down to younger generation, what we were talking about with the use of language, but do they in fact say, I just found a feeding ground 10 kilometers up the coastline? Obviously not that, but that they're
Yeah.
trying to signal things that are happening either in the environment, in the ocean, or more likely with feeding or with mating. Is there that kind of interaction?
I don't know. So the big question is, are they signaling or are they eavesdropping?
Hmm.
So if I am going fishing, but I am new to a region, I might go and I pass all the local fishing spots that I read about in the guidebook, but I'm going to stop at the one that has the most cars because other
Mhm.
people are catching fish there. Or I might stop where I see an angler reeling in a fish.
Right.
And that angler did not necessarily tell me you should come fish here. I just saw that he caught a fish.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to discern whether or not humpback whales are learning from one another socially because somebody is actively teaching, or is it simply that they're observing one another? There's not strong evidence for teaching, but
Hmm.
there is strong evidence for learning. So I think what probably is happening is that one animal stumbles on to something that works and another animal tries it too. And in doing that, a behavior
Is
become
established.
is
And
established.
yeah.
Yeah, and we see that with song. One whale can come into a population and start singing a new song, and the other whales will copy that song, and you'll see what's called a song revolution. So the whole song will turn over. But we also see it with foraging behaviors. If one whale discovers a new foraging behavior, it will slowly spread and spread and spread and spread and spread, even if that foraging behavior is a solitary behavior.
Hmm.
So, not strong evidence that whales are saying, hey, hey, come over here, try this, because humpback whales aren't that social. But there is strong evidence that a whale might say, that looks like a good idea. I think I'm going to try that too.
Amazing. Really, really, it's so interesting how complex they are.
Yeah.
Do male and female whales, both genders, use mating calls, or just
No,
one?
just the males. The males are the only ones that sing. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that song is very much a breeding call, and it's just the males that are producing it. The females are likely responding to it in some capacity. Um, but no, just the males that are singing.
And in terms of the whole breeding process, or alpha male territorial aggressive behaviors that you see all the time in different animals, do you see that in the whales as well? Are they aggressive,
There's
trying to keep out the other males and all of that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's definitely aggression, but there's no alpha male. So there's not a social hierarchy when it comes to humpback whales. Males are competing for access to females,
Yeah.
and they compete in small groups for access to females. But then there's also some evidence that that might not actually be when mating occurs. It might be driven more by female choice than it is by male aggression. Um, we've never effectively captured reproduction in humpback whales. We've never actually seen mating, or at least gotten it on camera. So it's hard to say exactly what the trigger is to make it work. But certainly the males are pretty aggressively competing for access to the females.
Right. Right. And do the females have a protective mode during the post gestation and when they've had the baby? Do they
Yeah.
stick around for some time at least to protect the baby from the orcas, which are, I guess, the only real predators that are?
Yes, yeah. So, female whales, when they first give birth, are going to stick around on these warm water breeding grounds for as long as they can. That's going to help that baby to have time to grow when it's still in a relatively warm environment, to help that baby gain weight before they start that long migration north. But it is a balance, right? Because as long as the female is on the breeding ground, there's going to be male whales that are fighting for access to her when she's just given birth. So she's not necessarily interested. But also, humpback whales will fast on the breeding grounds. So that mother whale is going to be lactating. She's going to be nursing that young, feeding gallons and gallons and gallons of milk every day, but she's not eating herself.
Hmm.
So there's a direct transfer of her body weight into the body weight of the calf.
Uh,
But they're going to have to migrate north as soon as possible so that she can start to eat again. So it's complicated for sure because there's all these male whales and they're splashing and they're singing and they're trying to get the attention of the female and she's just given birth and she's trying to keep this calf alive, but then she might also just have to stop really quick and reproduce, and then she's gonna be pregnant again, and they're headed back north. So a lot happening in a short period of time.
yeah, it must be interesting to watch that. Um, I think I read that you have witnessed, and others have anecdotally witnessed, altruistic behaviors within the humpback whale community. Is that
Yeah.
something you've seen and read about? And could you tell us a little bit about what that
Yeah.
is?
Yeah, I have both read about it, but I have actually witnessed altruistic behaviors. And when I first saw it, it kind of blew my mind, and I thought this must be unusual. But then but Bob Pittman wrote a paper about it. Um, there was a time when I was up in Southeast Alaska. I was working on a whale watching boat, and we saw a couple humpback whales swimming. They were probably, I don't know, a mile or two apart. And we got in the boat, we kept going, and we found a pod of killer whales, and they were actively hunting a sea lion, a Steller sea lion. And this sea lion was trying to get away, obviously. Now it made a lot of noise, splashing and swimming, and about 5 minutes into watching this, those whales that had been far away, those three humpback whales, stopped, swam in to where the killer whale was hunting the sea lion, and they formed a circle around it, or sort of a triangle with two whales in front and one whale behind it. And then one of the humpback whales turned upside down and put the sea lion on its belly and
Huh.
lifted it up out of the water and started slapping its pectoral fins to try and swat away the killer whales. Now, you mentioned before those pectoral fins are 16 feet long. They weigh about 4,000 pounds. They're really, really heavy. And so the damage that a humpback whale could do to a killer whale if it hit it is consequential.
Mhm.
And but it's hard to say what would inspire a humpback whale to risk itself to
Yeah.
protect this sea lion. And if I hadn't seen it myself, to be honest, I'm not sure that I would have believed it was true. But this group, these three humpbacks, they stayed with that sea lion for quite a long time, trying to protect it from those killer whales.
Interesting, isn't it? Fascinating,
Mhm.
fascinating. Just
Yeah.
astonishing. Um, Unfortunately, I'm looking at my clock thinking, oh, geez, we need to wrap this up. So let me just ask you one last question. Um, is there something you have learned from these many years you've been studying this and these animals and how astonishingly happening and intelligent and uniquely creative that they are in their tool use and their song use and their communications? What have you learned from them that might have been an insight we could apply to ourselves about how we should behave with our environment, with our being able to adapt to new environments, to survival, to nature? What's come to you from these years you've been doing this?
I would say one of the things that I think about that I've learned from humpback whales is that it is okay to take your time, and that slow change is good change, and that incremental change is important, that we have to continue to learn and grow, but we don't have to learn and grow all at once. And also that it absolutely is important to be a good listener. Um, Humpback whales spend more time listening than they spend talking. And I certainly think that that is a lesson that humans could learn from.
Michelle, it has been so much fun to talk to you about this subject, and I can't wait to talk to you about other subjects as well one of these days. Clearly, you have a very deep insight and an equally deep passion for these animals. So, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us here at the forum.
Of course, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye bye. Michelle, it's been so much fun to talk to you about a subject for which you clearly have not only deep insight, but equally deep passion. So thank you so much for sharing it with us today at the forum. And thanks to all of you for being with us. For links to related subjects and to find archived versions of this and previous forum presentations, go to shforum.org. And finally, after we thank the following people for their generosity in making the forum possible, we invite you to close your eyes and attune to the voices and songs of one of the oldest cultures on the planet.